Interactions and changes in ecosystems. Ecosystems rely on biotic and abiotic elements, as you all know. However, the new concept I'm going to introduce today is that there are certain factors that control the size of populations within an ecosystem. Those factors are food, suitable habitat, climate, and predators. These factors that control or limit the populations are called limiting factors. This is no different when you think about ourselves as human beings. What limits growth of a population? Well, the number of houses. If there is a fixed number of homes, only a certain amount of families can live there. If there is not enough food for everyone, people will leave that ecosystem. Climate. If the weather is not conducive to living there, if it's too cold or too hot, people will leave or choose not to live there. And finally, predators. Well, we as human beings don't have to worry about predators, but the animals do. So, whether there's enough food, whether there is a suitable place to live, climate, and how many predators are present will limit population of a species. These factors are called limiting factors. Words we need to know. When we discuss changes to an ecosystem, these are the important words we must understand. The first one is native species. And they are species that occur naturally in an environment. In Canada, we do not have a lot of native species anymore. Some native species that we do still have are certain types of geese, certain types of caribou. There's a marmot on Vancouver Island that is also a native species. We have more of the introduced species, and an introduced species is one that is brought to an environment where it did not live before. As soon as the European settlers started coming over to Canada and the European explorers, they brought with them different species. They brought with them different types of plants to grow in forms of seeds and planted them. They brought with them their own horses, their own cows, their own sheep, and those became an introduced species into our native land. Bioinvasion is the introduction of foreign species into a native ecosystem. These species are usually stronger than the native species or have no natural enemies. They quickly multiply and have dramatic effect on an ecosystem. So, when these introduced species, for example, let's talk about plants, were brought over by the European settlers and planted here in Canada, there was no natural predator to those introduced species. So they took over because there was nothing there to control them. So our native species started dwindling out. They were choked out by these new introduction of new plants. And therefore we have very little native species here in Canada that remain. This act where we have an introduced species come over is called bioinvasion. Now, to take it one step further, when that introduced species thrives in the new environment, they are now considered an invasive species. So as I read, when bioinvasion occurs in new species that has been introduced thrive, they are now referred to as an invasive species. Let's talk for a second about competition. In all ecosystems, there is competition. Ecosystems change due to biotic elements competing against one another to meet their basic needs. So, we said previously that a limiting factor was food. If there is competition for that food, that will change an ecosystem. If there is a limited resource, the most dominant species will win, and the other species will have to move elsewhere. And this is a factor that changes ecosystems. So in summary, when we start going about studying interactions and changes in the ecosystems, you need to understand what the limiting factors are. You need to understand what a native species is, an introduced species, bioinvasion, and invasive species.